today's topic of teaching would be on media ethics. Media ethics is a very important subject when it comes to understanding how journalism or the media industry operates. Now, media ethics is deciding what is right or wrong in terms of the standards and conduct that is carried out by journalists in this particular field and industry. So we'll begin by understanding what is ethics itself. Is it right and wrong, or is far more deeper than that? So we'll begin by understanding what ethics are in terms of the choices you make, how important it is in terms of fairness, how important it is in terms of the responsibility and honesty. What are the principles involved, and what is the integrity demanded on the part of those who are part of this industry? When we look at journalism, it is not just about collecting, gathering and evaluating news, but also how it is presented, whether the fairness doctrine has been followed or not. Ethics is derived from moral philosophies. So philosophy is a way of life, as we know, but moral means right or wrong. And it's that decision that we have to make in our mind with the help of our conscience that decides whether our conduct is right or wrong. It's not just a journalist who could be right or wrong. Also, it could be the industry itself or the company that's employing the journalist. What is their target? What is their objective? What is the demand of the public? Is it permissive or not? So ethics is a very far-reaching subject. It's an ongoing subject of discussion, and it is a never-ending subject as well. Very simply put, you can define ethics as principles or standards of human conduct. Before any decision is made, there is a part of deciding as to what should be or should not be done. And for journalists, their objective has always been to search for the truth. What is true? Is it factually correct or not? And if they fail in that standard or conduct demanded, then what is a penalty? What are the sanctions involved? And this is where we learn about media ethics. Is it just a subject that is conjured from the mind, or is there some regulations or control on the part of the government of India to ensure that the conduct of the media industry is just and proper? Are they searching for the truth? But while they're searching for the truth, are they losing sight of what is truly important? When we look at the profession of journalism, we look at it as gathering, evaluating and distributing facts of current interest. We're looking at the functions of the press, and the word press comes from the printing press itself, which was an innovation starting with the Industrial Revolution as to the use of paper and printing matter on it. And with that came journalism, the importance of education in the world, how people were curious about knowing what's going on around them. How is government responding to them? Is it serving their interest, or is it serving their own interest? And this is where the importance of the role of press came into play. Before the digital age, we had in the pre-independence era, we had colonialism, we had the English East India Company, and the technology of the printing press came from Great Britain all the way to India. And why was that important? Because for the first time, people who eventually became educated both in English or in the vernacular language were able to read and understand what's going on in their society. This conscious awareness of what's going on around them is what gave the real impetus to the development of press and journalism in the country. Now, during the course of this PowerPoint, I will not only show you the PowerPoint in terms of illustrations, but also I will also be working it out on the board itself. So far we have covered about what is the meaning of ethics? Is it right or wrong? And then ultimately we are searching for the truth. And we want to avoid lies altogether. That is a basic standard of conduct demanded on the part of your typical journalist. Well, from the printing press, which was the age-old technology, we have now moved on to the digital age, where bytes and information is determining content that we are seeing not just on the television, but on the computer screen as well. It's being generated online, sometime in real-time events as well. And social media has played a very important role, because social media today is giving the media industry a response. What do they actually think of the content being generated by the media industry itself, which was absent earlier. Earlier, with the printing press and paper-based information that was distributed all across the world in the form of press, did not get the kind of response in terms of their readership. They had to employ marketing specialists who would carry out surveys and find out what's actually their response to the content in the newspapers themselves. But today, in real time, we are able to get the response through social media, and that is the positive when it comes to social media. But there are many other ill effects of social media as well, because opinion, if it is not properly controlled, can be defamatory as well. And over here we'll try and understand how control is elastic. It can be strict or it can be flexible, and it's important that while you're expressing your opinion, which is what the journalist does, the public also does not get into the mode of defamation that we have seen. So there are many controls that are now being added on to new technology and responses that we are seeing in the media industry. Now, when I say that what are these controls, where are we drawing this power from? We are drawing this power from the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India was incorporated, was formed by our founding fathers. And even though it's a technical document, it has a far-reaching effect on our everyday life. Why is it so? Because the Constitution as a document itself is a guidance for the governance of a sovereign state. Now, what does that really mean? Why is it a guidance document? Because you have successive governments, they cannot overreach their powers. They have to stay within the scope of what is contained in the Constitution. And usually the average person understands the Constitution in terms of the basic rights, the fundamental rights. For instance, the right to life and liberty, which is our natural right. But there's also the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of the press. And these are the powers that the state draws upon to control the conduct of press and journalism, and also the press and journalists who draw the power from the Constitution to carry out their activities as a pressure group to ensure that the government toes a line of what is truly right. And the pursuit of truth helps them do that. So the Constitution is a guidance for governance of a sovereign state. It also shapes how a typical political party that comes to power is governing the nation. And it also imposes another standard that it must be a sovereign state, that is a state that is independent. That is a precondition which our forefathers had instilled into the Constitution, because when we were granted independence, it meant that we were a sovereign state. What does the Constitution promote? It promotes democracy. Democracy means that our elected representatives who are canvassing for votes come to power on the basis of what the public thinks of them, votes for them, and if that government fails, then the public has the freedom to outvote that government and bring in a new government. And that is a beauty of democracy. And the reason why democracy is successful anywhere in the world, especially India, is because there is freedom of the press with some controls. Now, this is an illustration of the general election of 2019 in the Lok Sabha. Once again, you have politicians who are canvassing for votes. From their manifesto, they are promising what they're going to achieve if they come to power. You have a number of national political parties in the general election, each in a competitive sphere of attitude, and they are trying to canvass votes. This is a manifesto, the promise on the part of the political party, what they intend to do once they come to power. And that document is important because the Election Commission is registering these documents. When they come to power, then the press chases the government and tells them that this is what you promised in the manifesto. Why is it that you are not fulfilling these promises that is mentioned in the manifesto? So together with the Prime Minister's office and the cabinet and the Council of Ministers, and also the appointed bureaucracy, government functions. And the press plays a very important role, because in this functioning itself, it holds the government accountable for what it promised in the manifesto. So the government and the press has to work together in a successful democracy, and this is what is enshrined in the Constitution of India. Coming back to the press, and we are now looking at freedoms, which is mentioned in the Constitution of India, the freedom of the press, and it draws its power, it draws its privilege, it draws the benefits of the media industry from the Constitution of India. And for that, the press has to register its entity with the Office of the Registrar of Newspapers of India, or the RNI. Now, the RNI, through its statute, imposes certain conditions, and it also grants certain freedoms. For instance, limitations on circulating a typical newspaper would mean that you cannot defame. You have to corroborate your story with facts. Opinions are important, but they must be backed by some corroborative evidence. That is a typical standard imposed on a journalist. You have the Press Council of India, which looks into the affairs of journalists. If they have done something wrong, then the average citizen or any other entity or person within the territory of India has a right to complain against that person, and it would be decided by a quasi-judicial authority which will look at the facts and circumstances of the case and see if the charge is made out or not. And if the charge is indeed made out, then they can penalize or sanction either the journalist or the publication itself. So coming back to the Constitution, because it's a very important document, we look at the typical freedom, which is the freedom of speech and expression. They're usually taken together, even though in our Constitution they're written separately. Freedom of speech, and then you have the freedom of expression. But when we talk about the freedom of speech, we're talking about the act, we're talking about the expression, and we're also talking about the relationship. Now, when we use the word relationship, it means that it is not a relationship of abuse. It cannot be an abusive relationship. You have to respect the rights that are granted to you, but don't forget the duties that you have towards the other person, which means that you cannot cross a line into what is deemed to be unconstitutional. Now, we'll understand in the course of this slide as to what is unconstitutional. So, Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution of India includes the freedom of speech. Freedom of expression. So beyond speech, one can express themselves. Just like I am right now before you talking about the constitutional powers granted to the citizen, there's also movement of my body. There's also expressions of my face. There's also my conduct, which need not be speech itself, and that comes under expression. From freedom of speech and expression, we have freedom of the press, again drawing its power from Article 19(1)(a). But remember, the journalist who is appointed by his or her organization is given special powers because they are a pressure group. They are granted this privilege of knocking on the doors of government and holding them accountable for anything that they deem to be morally wrong, or that is untrue, or is a lie. And that puts a journalist in a very peculiar position of being threatened of the life and liberty, and therefore there are shield laws which also put in place to protect the journalist from any kind of attack or abuse. So the Constitution gives special powers and privileges to the press because of its importance in the democracy. Along with freedom of speech and expression and freedom of the press, we have the freedom of assembly, where people have the right to assemble. They can peacefully tell the government or any organization about the misfortunes, about what the government or that entity should do to correct their course of conduct or their policy, but the assembly cannot go out of control, and that is a key limitation when it comes to the freedom of the press or the freedom of assembly. It has to be regulated, it has to be controlled, and that's why we come back to media ethics. And when we talk about media ethics, it's not just moral philosophy as you can see on your board, but it also includes statute, the Act of Parliament. When it is discussed in both houses of Parliament as a bill, it's passed by supermajority and then it becomes an Act of Parliament or a statute. So it lays down what the law is. The provisions of the law include the rules and the procedure to be followed, which we know as due process. So one cannot just overstep the boundary, they have to stay within the limits of the law, otherwise called the rule of law. Now, rule of law is an old common law tradition because our law and the making of it, the creation of the Act of Parliament, the statute that we are discussing about, comes from common law traditions. Because we were a British colony, we have drawn our model of administration and also the law-making power, including Parliament, from common law traditions. That's why we are mentioning about the rule of law. Now, what are the threats to the freedom of press? I spoke about the privileges, I spoke about the grants, which are special and peculiar to journalists. The reason is that there are threats to the freedom of press. And what are those threats? Usually by vested interests, and it can also be government for that matter. Defamation is the first standard that has to be avoided if you are a member of the press. There cannot be personal attacks on any individual. It has to be in public interest and not in private interest. And defamation is a punishable offense under the Indian Penal Code as well. And this was the law even in colonial times, and that has been taken forward in independent India as well. Now, there are two types of defamation. One is libel and the other is slander. Now, when the press was written, it was in paper format, then it was libel because it was written defamation. But slander is spoken defamation. And today, with the growth of social media and other electronic media, slander has become very commonplace. And therefore, the law has to be amended and also understood in terms of the context today. People are writing and they're speaking out as well because of the development technology like cloud computing, social media, their mobile phone. The access to so much information today is spoken as well. So slander is a defamatory offense. When you commit a crime like libel or slander, of course it's subject to judicial review. The courts will have to assess whether or not you have committed this crime of defamation or not. And once it's proved that yes, you have indeed defamed somebody, then you have to pay damages or compensation to the party that is a victim of your defamation. And the law of torts is about civil wrongs. And again, I'm using the word wrong here when it comes to the moral philosophy of ethics. So if you have committed a wrong, then the court system and society demands that you must be compensated and the wrongdoer must be punished in terms of the penalty imposed on the wrongdoer. But a more serious offense when it comes to abusing the freedom of the press is sedition. And that is where your criticism of the government goes overboard. And it goes to the extent that it is now seen as subversive. It threatens the very concept of government itself. There are threats to overthrowing the government. And the consequences of such an action is that if the government is overthrown in such an anarchist manner, then the government will not cease to exist and there would be complete lack of rule of law. It would be chaos all around. So even though the average person may not be happy with government on a day-to-day basis, without government, there would be chaos on the streets. So sedition is imposed on journalists who do become anti-government to such an extent that the attacks are not in public interest anymore, but they are in the private interest. So it is a very it's a discretionary power of the state, and they decide, and it's subjective as well, whether the action on the part of the journalist is seditious or not. It is a felony crime or a criminal act of subversion under section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. Even more serious than sedition is treason, where you are accused of directly attacking the interest of government. For instance, selling state secrets, where you are acting as a spy for an enemy nation, and especially now with the way borders are being threatened by nations like China, by nations like Pakistan, and even to some extent nations like Nepal, it is becoming a lot more dangerous, and the government has to be vigilant, carry out surveillance to ensure that treacherous activities are at a minimum, because these acts of criminality damage the nation far more, both in the short term and in the long term as well. And the penalty or the sanction when you commit treason as a journalist is very severe. It means rigorous imprisonment, and all your powers are taken away, including the license to profess as a journalist. Another limitation on the right to freedom of speech and expression, and even freedom of the press, is to prevent the crime of obscenity. The Constitution guarantees that yes, you can enjoy your fundamental rights, but it cannot be abused. And obscenity has become very subjective over time. Earlier attitudes were much stricter, therefore obscenity laws were more severe. Today, there is a new permissiveness in society, which has become more relaxed. It has borrowed a lot of its attitude from the West as well. So what was obscene before is no longer seen as obscene today. And pornography is seen as permissive, but a lot of societies also believe, and this is the attitude that is building up right now, that it damages the minds of the youth, and therefore press or media outlets that use some aspects of pornography to promote their material can be punishable, and therefore you need a regulatory authority that can sanction, at least warn the media outlet that what you're using right now could be deemed harmful to the public interest. It's a very subjective matter, and it requires a great deal of thought and insightfulness. Mark Twain, the famous writer of yesteryear, he wrote about indecency, vulgarity, obscenity. These are strictly confined to man. He invented them. Among the higher animals, there is no trace of them. They hide nothing. They are not ashamed. Another abuse of the power of press is to incite people in such a manner that they wish to riot. And that is a very serious subversive action where you undermine the authority of state, you compel them to use their military powers, their police powers to bring down or quash people who are assembling, trying to voice their opinion. But when it goes out of control, riots take place, and the damage to people and property is immense. Again, it's highly subjective. There are those who say that the right to assembly is being curtailed, but the government also has a responsibility to ensure that public spaces, property, injury to people is completely avoided. So this is all part of governance, and it is mentioned in the Constitution of India. Let's now try to understand censorship, and censorship is a very important limitation on the freedom of the press, especially when it comes to earlier obscenity, images being shown in the press and in the social media, or for that matter in electronic media. But today censorship is also a subject matter when it comes to right to information. So if you are seeking a document, if you're in the US Freedom of Information Act, if you're in India Right to Information Act, there are certain documents which in the interest of the state or to protect the right to privacy are censored. And again, this is subject to controls by the court. So if any aspect of information that you seek is being censored, can be challenged in court, and the judge then decides whether the censorship law stands or not. Again, due process is being followed, and judicial review on that matter decides whether or not the censorship should be imposed or should it be removed. Talking about courts and the pursuit of the truth, which is what I had started my presentation with. When it comes to moral philosophy, you are in ethics seeking what is right, what is wrong, but also the pursuit of truth, and that is the objective of the journalist. So similarly, the pursuit of truth is something that the courts also demand from the journalist or from any person, that you must testify in open court with truth. You put your hand on the Gita, the Holy Bible of the Hindu, and you speak the truth. If you lie, then you can be held in contempt of court and you will be charged with what is called as perjury. And this is under the Contempt of Courts Act of 1971. Investigative journalism. Now this is high-end journalism where again the truth is sought, especially in very difficult and complex matters. This is a special group of journalists who go out of their way to search for the truth. They're highly skilled, they're knowledgeable, and they unearth corruption in government and other private sector employments. and they do so as a specialized group with protections, otherwise called shield laws. And investigative journalism is a very special branch. You have the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who in fact unearthed what is going on in Panama, otherwise called the Panama Papers, where many high-end politicians had siphoned off public funds and deposited in the accounts there, which are also known as tax havens. And this is where the role of the journalist is so important, because they have overturned governments through the process of democracy, not through the process of subversion, but through the process of democracy, because people can then see if their representative is honest or dishonest and then take a decision when they vote for government. So I spoke about the right to information, the freedom of information, how important it is, so that even government is held accountable for its actions. And it is very important for the citizen, who has a right to petition the courts through writ petitions, to seek the truth not only through the judicial process but through the extrajudicial process, to ensure that administration is in line. And if administration or government has been wrong in their conduct, then they correct the course of action or compensate the victim of that conduct. With the growth of social media and what is being exchanged today, cyber crimes have also picked up. And over here, the enforcement agencies have a very strong role to play, because cyberspace is so large and it's so vast and so untapped that there are some who are able to deceive others, operate from cyberspace, and commit theft or robbery and cause great loss to the exchequer and to individuals as well. And this also includes hijacking information, where wrong information not corroborated by facts is circulated on the social media and even on networks, misleading people, deceiving them into believing what is actually not true. And this is a serious threat to national security. So we have spoken about the nation's interest. Let's look at the individual's interest. Right to privacy is extremely important. And if our right to privacy is violated, then we have the right to petition the courts, we have the right to file a criminal complaint, we have the right to take action, we have the right to seek compensation as well. And today, right to privacy is recognized as a fundamental right, and it is seen as a fundamental right because the growth of social media and invasive technologies by which in cyberspace, there are those who are able to steal information, who are able to broadcast information which is private to the individual concerned. Earlier, it used to be the domain of superstars or actresses who were the victim of privacy violations. But even the average individual today feels threatened, especially the financial information. So privacy laws have to be strengthened. Enforcement agencies are working to eradicate cybercrime and any kind of cyber violation, but more needs to be done, and it can only be done once we understand what the right to privacy is. From all this, we have to also understand what copyright is, because whenever a journalist comes out with their original work based on their research, based on their skill, based on their knowledge, then that content has to be protected, or for that matter, the organization which is paying the journalist to create that content. Now, their investment has to be protected, otherwise the industry will go haywire. Without copyright protection, anyone can copy, they can profit from it illegally, and there would be no rule of law. So the Copyright Act of 1957 protects those who are creating original and fixed work. And that is very important for the media industry, which depends upon copyright protection. And finally, I will discuss about plagiarism, which is another ill, and it's related to copyright, that is just blatantly copying someone else's work. We see that not only in the media outlet, but also in the assessment of merits of candidates when they sit for examinations, for instance. So copying in any form, whether of text, whether of images, is illegal. And when you infringe someone's right to copyright, then the offense is punishable in the criminal courts. Along with that, it is also compensatory. You have to pay compensation to the victim of the copyright holder. And with that, we conclude our presentation on media ethics. I hope you enjoyed it with our illustrative PowerPoint and how we showed it on the whiteboard. If you have any questions, we will reach out to you. We will supply you with our email address and you can write to us and